Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar on ice navigation and polar shipping. My name's Martin Fothergill. I'm the Marketing Manager at the Nautical Institute, and with me today are David Petraco, Director of Projects at the Nautical Institute from London, UK, and also Captain Duke Snider, Fellow and immediate past President of the Nautical Institute and Principal Consultant at Martech Polar, and he's joining us from British Columbia in Canada. Victoria, to be precise. The format for today, well, the webinar is going to last between 30 and 45 minutes, of which 15 minutes at the end will be taken up with a Q&A session. In a moment, I'll hand over to David, who'll say a few words, and then over to Duke for the main presentation. But as we go through, please do feel free to submit questions. You can do this through the control panel, which you can open and close by clicking on the white arrow in the orange box, top right of your screen. There's also a very useful additional resources handout available, which you can access through your control panel. And finally, do contact us at the email address shown on your screen if your question isn't answered, or if you simply want further information, or if you'd like us to actually email you the additional resources handout. So without further ado, I shall pass you over to David Petraco.
Thank you very much, Martin. And everybody, welcome to the Nautical Institute's series of webinars on technical issues. Just a little bit of background on why we do this. We're an international professional body, and our role is to assist our members and others in lifelong learning or continuous professional development. And this is part of that. We have a range of tools for helping our members learn on a regular basis. We have magazines, we have books, we have webinars, we do conferences, etc., and it's all about learning. And one of the nice things about our membership is that it's members helping members, which will be evident in this. So if you're not already a member, please consider becoming a member. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Captain David Snider, otherwise known as Duke, past president. Duke's had so much experience in polar areas that he's going to share with us. And if I recall, Duke, you've actually followed your father into the Arctic. And I think most children would have learned that, you know, when their father tries to lose them in the Arctic, but you obviously made it back again. So, went on to spend over 30 years in the Canadian Coast Guard and is now an ice pilot specializing in the Arctic. So without further ado, Duke, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar and thank you, and I will enjoy your presentation.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you, Martin, for the introduction and the technical guidance. For those of you that have been able to dial in today, I just want to say right up front that please keep in mind that this presentation is not a replacement for the effective training that is not only required but is available and experience out there. We've only got 30 to 40 minutes this morning, and it's really going to be a very basic and high level introduction to what we're talking about, to whet your appetite and let you know that it's not quite as it may seem. What we know, of course, and where the interest is that the polar regions are changing. Polar regions are at the forefront of the effects of global climate change. How does this affect the vessel operations? Well, to understand that, what we first have to do is understand what is really happening versus some of the myths and the hyperbole that are out there. Every year at this time, we see the same headlines pop up in the popular press about ice-free summers. The prognostications continue. How much reality is that? How much are the armchair assessments and opinions really true to what we're seeing as operating and active ice navigators against those realities. So what I'm going to do this morning is examine some of those myths and then discuss some of the practical implications. And again, this is not a training course in ice navigation, but will indicate why we have to be careful and what we need to be careful about. We will focus primarily on the Arctic, not for any other reason really than that the Arctic is where the predominant traffic occurs. The Antarctic is primarily confined to research traffic and resupply. Under the Antarctic Treaty, commercial use of the Antarctic is not permitted, nor is defense use. So we see the only commercial activity down there is related primarily to cruise traffic in the Antarctic Peninsula area, though some traffic does circuit around to other areas of the Antarctic. The numbers and the traffic numbers are not as high in the Arctic, and that's where most of our interest will be. I will touch on some specifics in the Antarctic through the presentation, but keep in mind that many, if not all, the operational aspects are very, very similar. When we look at our first myth, the basic one is, of course, the global climate change. The sky is falling. It's totally opened up the Arctic with ice-free summers. Well, that isn't the case, and regardless of the prognostications of some out there, it is slowly changing. If you look at this particular graph in front of you by the National Snow and Ice and Data Center, it shows the minimum Arctic sea ice extent. We have a similar graph for the Antarctic that matches this. Now, in this period, this is based on satellite information only over a short period from 1979 to 2015. But what it does indicate is that there is a general reduction in overall sea ice extent in the Arctic over the year through the variability. If we look at the variability year to year, we see that there are bad ice years where there is more ice than we want, down to good ice years. But this blue line is the trend that we see. When I first went to the Arctic in the 1980s as a junior officer, and what I see today is quite dramatically different. We have longer seasons, that is the navigational season with least ice starts earlier and ends later, and we are seeing the change to the type of ice. So the reality is we are seeing winters with less ice. They will continue and they will be a part of our recognition. But within that, variability still exists. And that is where the problem comes in. In the past, when we had very, very strong winters in both Antarctic and Arctic, ice would develop, a multi-year ice, particularly in the Arctic, would develop and it would hold back the heavier ice. What we're seeing now is that with the climate change, the thinner, less compact ice is more prone to faster drift and heavier deformation. The deformation causing ridges and overlaying and rafting of ice. The interesting thing in the Arctic is that without that heavy multi-year ice, to block off some of the islands, say in the Canadian archipelago, ice is being encountered in areas in the summertime that would not have been before. So where we had a very given expectation, you could get past Point Barrow into the Western Arctic by the 15th of July. Well, now you might get by 2 to 3 or 4 weeks earlier than that, but you might not. So what we have to consider is that the variability in the ice expectation is very, very broad and very extreme. And we have to be aware that where we thought there was going to be ice, there may not be, and vice versa. The closing one on this is that right now, good ice years does not mean ice-free. It just means that there's less ice and the overall extent. Ice can still be encountered. And if that is the case, we still have to build ships to deal with the ice. We still have to train people to deal with the ice. One of the classic misrepresentations we see in the popular press are these types of images that show a previous sea ice cover 1984 versus 2012. First thing I want to indicate in this is that this is based on a type of data that is thermographic. It's based on a satellite looking down and making a temperature assessment. We see in 1984 a very large extent of ice across the Arctic, well into the Canadian archipelago. We assume that this 2012 image indicates that there is only ice in this period here. That is not the case. What this image actually indicates is cold temperature areas. In fact, ice was well down into the Canadian archipelago through the season and down into this coast. 2012 was a least year at the time, pardon me, a period of least ice ever encountered, but it was not as low as this. We need to be aware of the difference between actual ice extent and what a satellite may see or may represent. The reality, of course, in 2016 is shown by a more complete assessment that comes out in ice service ice charts. In this case, we look at a period that the Russian complete Arctic image indicates ice coming right down into the Barrow Coast here. This is quite counter to what a thermographic image would have shown, which would have indicated none of this light 1/10 concentration ice. In particular, on a specific day, this is the highest point of continental America, Point Barrow here. This was on September 18th. On a normal year, we would not see any ice in this area at all. The ice would be well off the coast. However, the strong, heavy multi-year ice persisted right down to the coast up until the end of September, which caused quite a jam of shipping. Nothing could get by Barrow either east or west unless it was a heavy icebreaker. Another example is as recent as 2018, where in that period of between the middle of September to the end of September is the least period of ice that we would expect in the Arctic. In this particular year, ice jammed into the central Canadian Arctic here. Ships coming through the Northwest Passage would come down from the west, down through Amundsen, the southern route this way, and then up. We're blocked here. This year, resupply from Eastern Canada into the Arctic, western parts into Cambridge Bay and the various areas down in here, Cambridge Bay is here, could not get through because of this heavy block of ice. On the 24th of September, which should have been the most open period, we can see all this red ice has blocked up 9 to 10 tenths ice. This underscores that ice-free summers are not in our present world, and they won't be for some time. The next myth I want to look at is the classic one is that the Northern Sea Route and the Northwest Passage are becoming Arctic highways. The reality is the transits are increasing through the Northwest Passage and the Northern Sea Route, but not at a high rate level relative to global shipping. Many of the voyages that are going through either of those routes are still expeditionary in nature. That is, that they are well planned, well in advance. They are not a one-off voyage, just we're going to go through and get this. The operators are looking at these and they're trying them out. What we are seeing is an increase in destinational traffic. That's traffic in and out of these regions. The biggest driver is the Russian exploration, development, and export. That is the natural gas and the oil exploration and export. When we see the statistics out of the Northern Sea Route that talk about these massive increases in shipping in the Northern Sea Route, the vast majority of those numbers, whether it be tonnage or ship numbers, are based on ships coming in and going out, either in the exploration phase, the development phase, such as the construction of the Yamal LNG facilities, and the export. In the Canadian Arctic, it's Baffinland iron ore export. Svalbard is seeing an increase in passenger vessels, as too is the Canadian Arctic. And of course, the Antarctic has seen a steady but slow increase in interest in expedition and cruise ships down there. But it's not highway traffic across the north to save time and money. That's another topic that could be a webinar all in itself of why the highway across the north isn't going to happen anytime soon. But we have to be aware that with these incremental increases, we are seeing an increase in shipping, but it's not becoming this free-for-all highway. Now, these are some, the next two slides, this one and the next one, are produced by Rear Admiral Nigel Greenwood on a study, and I thank him for the use of these. These actually show numbers through the Northwest Passage in the period 1980 to 2016. And if you look at the total number, it looks pretty massive over 2016 as opposed to down here in that steady. But if you look at the numbers, the purple here, the magenta type color, I guess you'd call it, are fishing vessels. They're not deep sea ships. Down here, we see Coast Guard ships. We see research that goes up and down. This is general cargo, and you notice that the general cargo voyages in the Northwest Passage has been increasing. But these are the destinational voyages. When we start to look at the actual transits of the Northwest Passage, the big numbers are the adventurers. These are the folks with small yachts and trying the stunt of the year. But again, the numbers down here of Coast Guard ships, more or less steady depending on the year, government ships, tankers is about steady. Bulk carriers has a jump, but it's only because one bulk carrier went through in this particular year. One cargo ship went through, makes the numbers appear that they're growing. So that's steady but incremental growth is happening, not this massive run through the Northwest Passage. Another myth I want to talk about is comes from many of the environmentalists, and it talks about the opening of the Arctic and all of those crazy wackos that are coming up there and damaging the environment. Well, the truth is that the vast majority of operators of vessels are indeed the long-term players, and they all have a very high level of experience operating in these areas. Their crews are well trained, the ships are well found. The problem are these fellows, the adventurers. They're the ones that are causing the problem. This particular vessel limped its way from east to west through the Northwest Passage, being assisted a number of times by Canadian Coast Guard, and admonished and attempted to warn them that they couldn't get through it that year. They carried on and were eventually rescued by the United States Coast Guard. This vessel was a home-built vessel. The engine in it was a power plant from a refrigerated container. As you can see, the conditions that it was in right here when the U.S. Coast Guard finally got them were very close to the end of days for this crew. They were fortunate that the U.S. Coast Guard did have their one and only icebreaker available nearby to assist them at this time. But these are the people that are causing the issues with pollution, not large ships. The reality are ships like these that are ice-class ships, from heavy ice-breaking ships such as the Nunavik and the Norilsk Nickel ships and the Arctic Express, to Ponant's brand new, now delivered Polar Class 3 ice-breaking cruise ship. Again, these crews are well trained, these ships are well built, and they are operating with their eyes wide open. So as I say, new players are planning well in advance. Some of the examples, the Nordic Orion, which made the news in the Canadian press and somewhat in the global press a number of years ago as the first cargo ship to come through the Canadian Arctic Northwest Passage. Not quite true, but it was 4 years in the planning. And they never did come back with a second voyage. They found out that the risks were too great and the return wasn't great. Crystal Serenity absolutely did make news, but again, this voyage occurred with 3 years of very extensive planning, and one of the features of this voyage was that the Crystal Cruise Line actually chartered their own Icebreaker as a support ship that carried additional equipment for pollution response and survival, as well as many of the rubber boats used in the shore excursions. But the key here was years of planning before entering the polar shipping market. The biggest example, of course, of this is the Yamal LNG project in Russia. Again, 4 or 5 years of planning just on the shipping side alone. What ships are necessary, getting the ships built, training the crews, making sure that they are ready for the harsh environments. So operating in the polar regions is not for the faint of heart. One has to have the equipment and one must have the experience, because regardless of climate change, as long as this generation that's viewing this show right now is alive, there's going to be ice to deal with. So why is the ice such a problem with us? Well, it's a changing ice environment. These are the challenges that will face us when we enter into operations in the polar regions. In the Arctic in particular, the polar pack is multi-year ice, that is ice that is remained over a summer melt and each year gets harder. In the Canadian Arctic, icebergs can be encountered in the Baffin Bay and Davis Strait area, while in the Antarctic, icebergs can be encountered almost anywhere around the circumference. That's a broad statement, and I know those with extensive Antarctic experience will say, what about this? But the general description is that for the most part, the Antarctic is an area of first-year ice. There is less multi-year ice to consider. However, there is more glacial ice. Multi-year ice and glacial ice are both, for different reasons, much, much harder than first-year ice that melts out. The other thing that we have to consider, and I usually get accused of harping on this, but it comes back to the variability, the changing conditions year to year. 1 year is a good year, the next year is a bad year. They tend to go in 11-year cycles, even with global climate change. So we see a peak of a bad year at 11. It improves over the next 3, 4, 5 years, and then we have another peak bad year in about 11 years. That transit, or that cycle of good and bad ice years still exists regardless of climate change, but we can have variability within that, and climate change is causing greater variability. In the Antarctic, as an example, going into McMurdo, in 2017, the icebreaker Polar Star had to break up to 60 miles of ice to get the ships in to resupply. The next year, they only had to break 13 miles. So 1 year is different from the next. The other big thing, of course, is ice remains for the bulk of the year encircling the Antarctic and filling the Arctic. The navigational seasons for non-ice-breaking ships is very short. When planning a route, one has to consider that there are choke points. One can't simply do a speed times distance calculation and say, okay, I know that I'm going to travel at 14 knots or 12 knots or 10 knots for the length of my voyage, and therefore I'm going to burn this fuel, and therefore I'm going to save this much money because I've gone this many miles fewer through either the Northern Sea Route or the Northwest Passage. If this slide and the next one show, there are areas that are known for collecting ice and can cause the best laid plans of mice and men to go right out the window. We have to understand that we have to factor in not just weather, but ice, which can move a ship. Plan can put speed delays in, can stop a ship dead in its tracks or cause large diversions. Similar to the Northwest Passage, the Northern Sea Route has very discernible areas of ice collection and persistent choke points. We have to take these into consideration when we're planning. Why is it still primarily the usual players or expeditionary? Well, one of the first things is the local lack of local infrastructure. This is a very interesting picture. I like this. This was our Prime Minister of Canada the day in 2008 announced that they were going to build a fueling station for naval and Coast Guard ships in the Canadian Arctic in an effort to support Coast Guard and naval operations. 2008, the facility is not fully operational yet today. The Arctic, Northwest Passage in particular, they are remote areas. The Northwest Passage is only small villages up to 1,000 to maybe 2,000 in specific regional areas. The big thing here is that there are no resupply, no port, no fuel, no repair facilities in the Northwest Passage through the entire passage between Nuuk and Dutch Harbor. The Northern Sea Route, though there may be higher population density in some areas, up to 10,000 in some of the port cities built in the communist days, there is no, or has been up until very recently, very little support for shipping other than getting into the ports for the resource extraction. From the western side, of course, from Norway into Novaya Zemlya, where the main focus of the EDE hydrocarbon development is going on, it's much better infrastructure. That's where the money's going in. That's where the infrastructure consists. Russia has always made a heavy commitment to provide icebreakers, unlike North America and the remainder of the European Arctic. But you must navigate that complex bureaucracy. Again, that could be another webinar in itself. Search and rescue. Much has been made of the Arctic Council's 2010 agreement of search and rescue division of areas. This shows the responsibility areas for the Arctic Ocean amongst the Arctic coastal states. Though we see a very, very nice chart that indicates who's responsible for what, it's the backup of that, whether there's actually resources to conduct search and rescue in the area. The Antarctic as well is well divided for responsibility. There are regions of response, but what is the capability to respond? The emergency support is in fact quite limited. Russia has aggressively been building SAR infrastructure, building a number of small search and rescue stations along its coast. 10 to 12 have been built over the last 10 years, but their capability is mostly shore and small vessel capability. They're putting their rubles into renewing their icebreaking fleet and renewing or rebuilding military bases that provide the jumping off points for pre-positioned air assets. We're not seeing a similar response to developing Arctic search and rescue in the rest of the Arctic. Canada has not bolstered its icebreaking fleet. In fact, there's only one ship right now. We'll get to that. That's under planning. The U.S. Coast Guard, however, does pre-position some assets, air assets in particular, into their Arctic around Alaska for the summer season, but it's very limited. The Antarctic depends primarily on vessels of opportunity. So unless there is an Arctic or an Antarctic resupply ship in the area, if a vessel comes into difficulty, it can be days before anything comes on scene. Charts and charting. we become accustomed in the rest of the world that we can get incredibly well surveyed charts, very up to date almost anywhere we go. But it is true in both the polar regions that there are some issues, primarily because of the lack of shipping and the lack of interest. There hasn't been an awful lot of continuous work to survey. And one of the first things that one would notice is that adjoining charts often have different datums. What that results in is positional shift. A position plotted on one chart will appear to be sometimes 1 mile different than plotted on the next chart. The problems are less of an issue when we get to electronic charts, but the electronic chart coverage is not complete. And in fact, we can see even particularly in the Canadian area, the areas that are covered by raster and vector charts don't quite overlap very well. There is a region in the Canadian Arctic today that still does not have an effective ENC covering it. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that for the most part, the areas in both the Antarctic and Arctic that are frequently traveled are reasonably well covered. We may still encounter charts with sporadic soundings, with just trackline soundings, but generally speaking, in well-traveled areas, the charting is up to modern standards. It is the areas outside these corridors that become difficult, and that's where we usually see adventurers traveling and coming to grief. So in planning a voyage, one has to be very, very aware of the chart in use, what its survey data is, what it's dated, what the projection is it a polar economic chart, or is it a Mercator? And we have to be aware of these things that normally wouldn't pass through our minds for a fleeting moment down south. But if I can say again and again, if you're basing all of your work on ECDIS equipment, you may have some issues. Icebreakers. We get a lot about this in the mail or in the press, but the truth is Russia has always had a greater interest in shipping in their own Arctic than the rest of the world. And the only ships operating in the Antarctic, for the most part, are resupply, other than the few cruise ships into the Antarctic Peninsula. Russia is aggressively renewing its icebreaking fleet because they have a huge economic reason to do so. The ships are needed to continue to export their main source of foreign dollar income. USA, on the other hand, only has 2 operational polar icebreakers, the Healy and the Polar Star. They have moved ahead, and they have begun construction of the first of what are hoped to be 3 polar security cutters, essentially replacements for the Polar Star and the Polar Sea. Canada in any given year commits up to 6 icebreakers. They'll often say that, oh, we're going to send 8 icebreakers to the Arctic, but that's 8 throughout the time. More likely that you only see 5 or 6 in the Arctic in any given day. The delivery of the single polar icebreaker that was ordered in 2008, is indefinitely delayed. It was originally to be delivered, pictured here, on the right in model form, as opposed to the US Coast Guard cutter Healy and Canada's present polar icebreaker, the Louis Saint Laurent. We won't see it before 2026, and at this point only 1 is ordered. Communications are one of the biggest challenges. For the most part, the high Arctic and the high Antarctic are outside of normal Inmarsat coverage. An interesting piece that always gets many is that the coverage for Inmarsat over the Pacific and over the Atlantic, the gap in coverage comes down right in the middle of the most interesting navigationally challenged part of the Canadian Arctic. The same gap between the Pacific and the Atlantic occurs right in the middle of the Northern Sea route. So mariners coming through must be prepared to lose good Inmarsat. VSAT tends to have a better coverage, but they still are centered with the geostationary satellite systems over the equator, and that coverage does reduce. Systems such as Iridium and the new Iridium Next are available in the polar regions, but they're much slower and they don't have the bandwidth, making it difficult to keep up with what we become normal communications. We often have to fall back on SAT-C or HF. HF, of course, is affected by solar activity and can be intermittent. And it's only been recently that nav areas have actually been identified and set up over the Canadian Arctic and covering, though they've been in place over the Southern Ocean for many years. Insurance, though it's not a strictly operational problem, it's one that usually catches people off guard. We look at the waters and the places not covered by special agreement. They're over the polar regions. Ships have to, depending on your insurance policy, your P&I and how it works, your rates can go through the roof in a heartbeat by coming into either of these two red areas. So I'm going to come back to another one of the myths at this point, and it's based around the Polar Code. Much publicity came out of the Polar Code 2015, 2016, and there's been a lot of discussions that it's going to solve or it's not going to solve these problems. Well, the Polar Code, though yes, it's finally the first mandatory IMO code, it is not solving all the problems. Having been through an awful lot of the work as the Nautical Institute's delegate to IMO discussions in communications groups, correspondence groups, working groups, subcommittees, committees, the Polar Code is the first attempt to come up with a standardized international base of regulations. There have been, however, in the background for many years, many coastal state regulations that have been in place for decades, covering the Arctic in particular. Canada's Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act and regulations, Russia's rules for navigating the Northern Sea Route, and a sometimes confusing group of American regulations based around Open 90 and Alaskan state requirements. But there have been regulations and they have been robust. They've just been varying. What the Polar Code has done, though, has come up with that baseline. The first Polar Code was envisioned in the 1990s. Canada made a very, very large submission to IMO, and at the time the appetite did not exist, and we got first guidelines for Arctic ships. The Antarctic Treaty Organization at the time decided its regulations were good enough, and the first guidelines to come out of IMO, very, very light guidelines, applied only to the Arctic waters. Only after a number of very, very newsworthy incidents in the Antarctic area of ships coming to grief did the Antarctic Treaty Organization come back and say, we'd like to be included. 2010, the guidelines became polar guidelines. A few more incidents occur, same as the Titanic and Solus raises the attention. The decision was made to come up with a mandatory Polar Code. The thing with this one is that the decision was made to not have a standalone instrument such as Solus or MARPOL, but to have a Polar Code that would actually be enabled by 3 other instruments. So before the Polar Code could become effective, there had to be amendments to Solus, to MARPOL, and STCW to actually give effect and strength. Excuse me. It is a baseline mandatory code, which means that nations should look to this as the core of their own regulations. Canada has attempted to maintain some of the stringency of the the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act and regulations as an example, but in some ways has watered them down to meet the lower standard for the Polar Code. So one of the things that we noticed, particularly from the Nautical Institute, was that in the requirement for the Polar Code for training, the Polar Code requires ships of either a category A, B, or C, depending on their plans for operating in no ice, some ice, hard ice, depending on the type of ship, whether it's a tanker, passenger ship, a cargo ship. The officers have either what's called a Polar Waters Basic or Polar Waters Advanced Training Certificate. The courses that are now approved for this, there's a multitude of them being conducted around the world. The one thing that the Nautical Institute noticed and industry noticed was that the Polar Code courses are not ice navigator courses. The certificates that individuals come out with at the end of the day are that they have attended a training course that may have had some simulation to it, but they are not required to have had any time in ice. An individual with a Polar Waters Advanced Certificate who can legitimately operate as the master of a ship may have never seen any ice in their career whatsoever. So they're not necessarily ice navigators. When the Polar Code standards came out, the STCW amendments indicated that this gap would exist. The Nautical Institute was approached and by industry, by some ship operators and by insurance, and asked to renew their efforts to put in place the Nautical Institute Ice Navigator, and that's what exists today. So an operator on a ship can technically get away with Polar Waters Basic or Advanced training, depending on their position, but more and more insurers and operators are looking for the additional certification of Ice Navigator. For example, my company, which provides ice navigators around the globe in polar regions in the Antarctic and the Arctic, we require all of our team members to be holders of current Master Mariner certificates of competency, appropriate medicals, appropriate other certificates, Polar Waters Advanced, and the Ice Navigator Level 2. This allows us to ensure that we have the best trained and the best experienced people to go on board ships where they don't have the experience. This is what's being looked at throughout the industry as an industry standard, much the same as getting a tanker endorsement. One will have a Polar Waters endorsement as well as an Ice Navigator endorsement. So these are just some of the aspects that we look at. I suspect that many of the attendees watching this webinar were expecting an ice navigation course and an awful lot of details, but I do believe there are some specific questions that we can deal with on detail items. I'd be happy to take these on. I want you to walk away from the presentation part understanding that the myths and the realities are quite different. We're not cowboys, we're trained professionals. It's not a melee of pollution. It's well-built ships, well-found ships operating in the polar regions. Though we look behind us and what's taken us to the future, there's been a huge change in technology and experience, but I do believe that where we're moving to is a better place of knowledge and capability. And with that, I'll close the formal presentation and I'll open for any questions. And I hand the session back to Martin and David.
Well, thank you so much, Duke, for that presentation. Absolutely fascinating. We do have quite a lot of questions, much more than time will allow. But one of them that sticks out, you talk about technology and training. There are some specialist ice simulators. How effective are those?
Well, that is an incredibly good question. The answer is the range is quite broad. We've been working, certainly in my role with the Nautical Institute, with training institutions for many, many years. Some of the simulators out there are incredibly good, but we have to understand that simulating a ship interaction in ice takes an awful lot of computer horsepower. We can look at a simulation where companies will market to some smaller training institutions. Here's our ice simulator, and I've been asked to come in and vet their course and say, I'm sorry, this just isn't going to do it, because all the simulation does is change the blue water to white water and allow for polygons to be inserted that look like ice floes going by from that simple level. To the more advanced level, simulators in some of the training institutions that have been doing this for years and contributed very highly and extensively to the development of the Polar Code and the training modules are very, very good. The Makarov Institute in St. Petersburg is an example. The Marine Institute of Memorial University in Canada, St. John's. Two incredibly capable, well-developed simulators that are very, very effective. In fact, the Polar Code strongly suggests that simulators be used, as does the Ice Navigator scheme from the Nautical Institute. We are getting to the point where they can provide some skill and ability, but they're a long way off of replacing actual time in ice, where you get to feel the ship moving in the ice and actually have to play it. But we're getting there.
Thanks, Tuke. There are quite a lot of questions coming in about the hydrographic data and what is being done to improve the capture of it, particularly during the melting conditions, and are forward-looking sonars being used, and do they contribute to crowdsourced data for the hydrographic community?
Well, another good question. The basic answer is that particularly in the Arctic, the responsible hydrographic organizations are all working diligently to and extensively to increase the coverage of what we call modern standard hydrography. The first point to understand is, and I mentioned in the presentation, is that for the most part, at this time, any place that someone wants to take a ship or would want to take a ship is going to be reasonably well covered. As an example, a lot of pundits talk about the Canadian Arctic only being surveyed to modern standards for about 10% of the Arctic. Well, that's because the other 90% we really don't want to take ships to. There's no reason to. And please don't walk away saying Canadian Arctic is charted to 10%, because the actual percentage, it grows every year. The Northern Sea route is the same. The routes that are regularly transited are fairly well covered. We look at things like cloud sourcing. There's been an awful lot of interest placed into that to gather up a broader breadth of information. The biggest problem I know that the hydrographic agencies have with this is the actual ground truthing. When hydrographic institutions go out, they ground truth, they've got their positions fixed within centimeters using their own differential GPS. They know exactly what it is, but the crowdsourcing stuff doesn't have that same assurance for quality assurance. So until they can get a more assured quality assurance system in place to quantify that, It's a nice thing to have, but it's not going to be wound into charts anytime soon. Forward-looking sonar, there's been a lot of talk about that for ice detection. My own personal experience is not terribly effective. It requires or needs a fairly deep keel on the ice to send a return back, and quite honestly, what we're getting now is less and less multi-year ice in the Arctic that has that sort of keel. So it may be of some help, but it's not an answer for ice identification at this point.
Okay, thank you. There are also many questions to do with compasses, both magnetic and gyro. What do you use for compass up in the high latitudes?
Well, of course, in the Arctic, that number one thing is the magnetic compass starts to spin around like a dervish is not quite true, but the reliability is off. Today, we look to a gyro compass. More typically, the fiber optic compasses are being used because of the lack of precession. Depending on the actual design of a standard gyro compass, once you get even up to the higher latitudes, it begins to suffer from precession and it'll lag. So recently, the last 20 years, we've found more reliability in fiber optic compasses or GPS corrected compasses. Those are the two that are finding the most use in both polar regions.
Okay, thank you. Also, not surprising, you've got a lot of compliments on your presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
But you've sparked a lot of interest from people wanting to know, is it possible to find careers in polar navigation or polar operations? And how would a young person in the industry look to that opportunities?
Absolutely. I'm sitting in front of you as an example of a young man that got the Arctic bug from a father who flew over the Arctic for many years in the Royal Canadian Air Force, and then was given the opportunity to gain experience in a Coast Guard fleet. Polar shipping remains a niche area, but it is incredibly rewarding. I absolutely love what I do. I love the opportunity to get into the Arctic or the Antarctic and get into the ice and work it. It remains the last seat of the pants sort of region in the world where you have to be really, really good at what you're doing to complete a voyage safely, but you have to prepare for it. You have to gain the experience. For a young woman or man looking into it, what you're going to have to do is to try and find the opportunities to get on board ships that are in the area to build the experience. Nothing can replace the actual experience of working ships in ice. We talked about the simulators a few moments ago. They're getting close, but they're not the same. The steps that they need to do are beyond the actual physical experiences to get the training. The Nautical Institute Ice Navigator is one piece. Certainly they have to start with obtaining the basic polar waters advanced or polar waters basic training to get into the job as a watchkeeper on any ships that are going to be seriously in ice. I would strongly recommend, not just because I'm a Nautical Institute member for many years, but I would strongly recommend that any young woman or man looking into this, if they're going to get a polar waters course, they also look to getting the Nautical Institute level 1. Find a school that conducts the training in both certification fields so that they come out with not just a polar waters basic certificate, but an ice navigator level 1. They then go out and with both certificates would then collect the appropriate time in polar waters, the appropriate time in ice, and then come back for a advanced training / level 2 training, and get that under your belt. The team that we've got, we have more than 24 very experienced master mariners. All of the team, as I said earlier, have Polar Waters Advanced Training, all have Nautical Institute Ice Navigator Level 2. Some have gained their experience as icebreaker captains, some on cargo ships, some on passenger ships. We've got team members from all around the world, Canadian, American, British, French, New Zealand, Australian. We even have one ice navigator from Lebanon. So, you know, it's a region of our industry, or part of our industry, that anybody can become part of, but you're going to have to focus on it.
Okay, thanks, Duke. But Martin, we're running out of time, aren't we?
We are. I mean, I've got a few more questions.
Okay,
I don't know whether we...
There's been a huge amount of interest in this, and I might just take this opportunity to introduce this really nice book. Anybody wanting to learn more about polar operations, and it's written by a guy named Captain Snider. So highly recommend it, and there's a link to it in the headnote. Martin, what do you got?
Yeah, I'll just fire off with a couple more questions, if I may, Duke. Here's one. Are there many sailboats that venture through the North Passage, and do any of them come into jeopardy?
I did touch upon this somewhat in the presentation. Admiral Greenwood's slides showed a very large number. When I was with Coast Guard, that was one of the things that kept me awake at night. It was the adventurers that were coming through. They were the ones that more often than not came less prepared than well prepared. The short answer is yes, there are. Because there is still a lack of real good understanding of how challenging a polar voyage can be. There will always be an adventure coming through, and some of them are very, very well prepared. Some of them, as that picture I showed you of the nameless boat, I won't give it a name, they come very ill prepared. Riding Hobie Cat sailboats through the Northwest Passage to make a documentary is not a wise idea in my mind.
Okay, thanks, Duke. Let's have one more question. How effective are drones in ice reconnaissance?
Drones are proving more effective as development goes on. One of the beauties, of course, of the drone is that it provides you that remote sensing, visual sensing, you know, a distance from the ship. One of the problems is that with drones, you have to also be a skilled operator. We looked at for a short period of time whether we would start to integrate drones into our ice navigator service, and quite honestly, the cost and the training of an individual ice navigator to do this, to operate them and actually navigate the ship, it didn't make sense for us. FedNav has the large Canadian operator of polar ships has looked in as operated drones on a trial basis, where you can actually get a high quality drone with a well qualified operator. They can be incredibly valuable. We see them more on research ships because a research ship can afford the space and the time for the flight crew, as it were, to handle the aircraft. I think they will become more and more commonplace as the operation becomes much more simplified. They certainly are being used, and the quality of the video can be incredible.
Well, I think we probably better draw things to a close because we've overrun somewhat. But thank you ever so much, Duke, for an absolutely fascinating presentation, and thank you to David for looking at all the questions. And thank you for everyone that's tuned into this webinar. We really appreciate your attendance and your interest. Don't forget, if your question wasn't answered, or you simply want further information, or you weren't able to download the additional resources handout, then please do contact us at the email address shown on your screen. And one final point, everyone who registered for this webinar will receive an email with a link to a recording. So if you had to duck out for 10 minutes or so and you missed part of it, you will be able to watch it again in its entirety. So once again, thank you very much for attending, and we'll see you next time. And in the meantime, please do stay safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Duke.
Thank you all.